My name is Laura Shumway. I am on the Storette team at EPA, and today I am going to talk about crosstab import configurations. To start with, I wanted to kind of give an overview of the water data flow with WQX. WQX is the shared data format that we use to share information to Storette, and then in the long term we share that information in combination with USGS and USDA to the water quality portal. WQX can be sent via a node client, virtual node, using a coding type of submission, but we also have WQX Web, which we will highlight today, which is a more Excel-based upload tool that is pretty easy to operate. So when to use a crosstab import configuration? A crosstab import configuration is beneficial when your data is always in a format that does not look like the WQX template. For example, you can see in this file here, it doesn't look like the template. If you've seen the template before, the template has each record in one row, not in a column. So the column name would be named characteristics. So let's look at that real quick. So the exact template looks like this. So every record contains one result for one characteristic. But when the data has a column for each characteristic, a crosstab import configuration is the best way to go. And for example, this file is coming off of a probe, like a sonde of a sort, and it's always going to produce the data the same way. And so if you create a crosstab import configuration, that crosstab will continue to work as long as your data continues to come off in the same consistent manner. In addition, using a crosstab import configuration eliminates work, because a lot of people take the data and they copy something from a probe and paste it into the Excel template. Well, you don't have to do that, so we can use a crosstab import configuration to circumvent that process. It lessens data entry and data translation errors, so you don't have to copy and paste and mispaste somewhere something, mispaste a pH record and put it into a temperature record. There's no worries with that. It's going to go through the way it is. And then you can continue to use the same import configuration if you always get your data in the same format, just reiterating that piece. So let's get to it. So I want to show you what a basic import configuration looks like. If you've never been to CDX, this is how you log in. Like I said, my name is Laura Shumway, and I am going to log in here. And you can see that we have different roles. So my role is only for WQX Web. You might have multiple roles if you work for other programs and need to submit data for those as well. But for this purpose, let's select WQX Web. While this is loading, let's go over to the Excel template again. So the Excel template and normal data submissions, there are import configurations. Take one step back. An import configuration just tells our database which column you have which data in. So it just says, oh, the project ID is here, and the project name is here, and the project description is here. So it can check those columns for the correct rules. So we have rules for the data set. So project ID, for example, can't be longer than 35 characters long. So if you said your project ID was in your project description, that would cause errors because your project description is probably longer than 35 characters long, for example. So when we have a normal import configuration, it'll say column A is project ID, column B is project name, and column C is project description. So let's check that out. If we go in to our import configurations, you can go quick link to the import configurations by going here. This looks like a lot of import configurations. I have access to all the import configurations, but when you come in, you shouldn't have those. You'll have only the ones that you've created and these training user template ones. So if you go over here and you say, I want to look at the WQX Web template projects, it matches the template I just showed you perfectly. So let's project ID is in column A, project name is in column B, and project description is in column C. Once again, let's go back to the physical chemical template, and you can see that that is true. Furthermore, we can see that the projects are on sheet 3. So instructions are sheet 1, export is sheet 2, projects is sheet 3. And then if you go back to the submission of the Excel import configuration, it says that it's looking for a Microsoft Excel file, which that's what we have, and it's looking for the 3rd sheet, and that is correct as well. So that's how the normal import configuration goes. If you guys are on this step of crosstab, you're probably very familiar with this, but that was just a brief overview. Let's look at something a little bit more complex. So let's go to import configurations. And let's add a new one. We're going to do it from scratch. And I have a results file I want to work with, so it's going to be an activities and results. Continue. Okay, so now we're starting with a fresh template. This is great. So first thing we want to do, if we're doing a crosstab import configuration, is enable expert mode. If you aren't comfortable, if you're using an existing template, if you didn't open up a new one, you didn't create one from scratch, make sure you copy it, you do a save as, so you have a second copy of that old one, because once you enable expert mode, you could accidentally ruin an old import configuration that you already used successfully. So make sure if you're creating one from the, if you have an existing one and you're working from it, make sure to save it as first. But if you start from scratch, you won't have to worry about that. So first, let's look at this again. You can kind of see that this is the basics that you need to import your data, activity IDs, media names, etc. But we're going to enable expert mode, and you'll see how this changes. So we can now see that it says which columns, correct? And so we can say activity ID. So we don't have an activity ID in this file. This is the file we want to import. In this file, we have, let's look at this. Let's expand these out a little bit. We have all our results, we have our date, and we have our time, which is great. And so for the purpose of this example, we're going to say that all of this information was collected by a probe, so nothing was sent to a lab, which is true. So that will make our generated values easier. And this is all water samples. And then we need to add one thing. So all data submitted to WQX Web and WQX needs an activity ID. So what is an activity? An activity is all values collected using the same equipment, all record or results using the same equipment at the same location at the same time on the same date. So if you were collecting data with a probe, but you were also collecting data with a water bottle, those would be 2 different activity IDs. But every characteristic sampled under the probe would be under one activity ID. They would all be in the same one, as well as anything collected under the water sample that you took, the grab sample. So let's label this activity ID. This is an example file, but there shouldn't be 2 station IDs. That's essentially what that annotation is. It's a station ID. So we want to create an activity ID, and my favorite way to create an activity ID is do a combination of date, time, and station. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say equals concatenate, concatenate, and then I say select from the station, put a comma, and then I want to put a space. So how to put a space? I do quotation, space, quotation. So it says put whatever I put in the quotation. If I put a comma, it would put a comma there, but I put a space. And then I'm going to say, okay, take the date, put a comma, put another space, and now I also want you to put the time, and then end of parentheses. Okay, we can see that what this looks like is no longer date and time, and that happens pretty frequently. Because this file is actually a date, or this column is a date column, and this one is a time, or a custom column, which is essentially the time column, we need to make sure we reformat that. So to reformat those, we say text, and then we say A2, which is the date, and I want it to look like, once again, we use the parentheses, and we say, nope, we don't have to use parentheses. I want to say month, month, ooh, I think we do, month, month, day, day, year, 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 comma. Let's just say, oh, sorry, got mad at me there. We have to do into parentheses there. And see how it reformatted my date? You see how it says 10, 17, 12 now? Let's do the same thing with our time. So if we say text, which means change this field or that column, B2, and change it to hour, hour, minute, minute. See how that works? Yes, that's fine. Oh, it needed a double parentheses, which is the error it gave me. So I'm going to say yes, go ahead and make that selection. So it says this happened at P2. This is on date 10/17/2012, and this happened at 10/12. What I'm going to do is copy. Actually, you don't even have to copy. Watch this. Drag this corner, go all the way down to the bottom of your data set. Perfect. And so it auto-filled for us. So let's save that. I do want to keep using a CSV. That's great. So now our data file contains everything it needs to submit to WQX. So the only thing that you usually have to add is an activity ID. So let's go back to the import configurations now that we know our file. So we know date and time exist in the first two columns. So let's scroll down to find date and time. Here we are. Date is in the first column, so it's in column A. These are the easy ones. These look just like they do in the other import configurations. So let's go to time. Perhaps time isn't a default on here, so let's add a new one. So we select here and we go to activity start time. Then we say OK. And then we go, activity start time went all the way to the bottom, but we want that to be in column B. All the way up to column B. Okay. We also know that activity ID is in column K. See that? Column K is activity ID. So let's go over here and find activity ID, and let's make that column K. Perfect. All right, now let's look at the rest of those things that the basic import configuration contained. So it said activity type. So let's look at what activity types are. What are examples of activity types? So this is why I said we're assuming that this is all probe data. So if it's all probe data, it's field measure observation, this first one. But that value does not exist in our data set. So what we're going to do is we're going to create a generated value for that measurement. So let's go here, and you can see generated values, i.e. not in your import file. So let's pick some. So it says organization, because we don't have organization in our file, but we also don't have activity type. So let's go there, activity type, and let's say OK. All right, and so let's default that value, and let's default it to field measure observation. Now we can scroll down to activity type, and we can delete that out. Perfect. No longer there. Activity media name. So that's the same thing. It's one of those things that do not exist in our file, but it's a generated value that we can use. And before I said our activity media is water, and so let's add that too. So we picked it there on this little, you see this little document button. And so activity media name. You can see that our activity type is still selected because we have multiple generated values. And let's hit OK. Activity media name, we select the default value, and we say it's water. Did you see that, how that was done? I said default value, water, and then I selected it. We can do the same thing with organization ID. When you select this default value, it's only going to give you the options of organizations that you have access to. But I have access to all of them, so you're seeing all of them. But you would have only yours and maybe a couple others plus WQX test. I'm going to use the WQX test here because it is better for me not to submit fake data. All right, so here's WQX test. And just as word to the wise, every once in a while, go ahead and save this import configuration. Make sure you put a name. So let's say crosstab example. Save. All right. And this is really great. So it's fun to save frequently too, because it's saying, well, you have start date and you have start time, but you don't have a format on those. And you need a start time zone, which we can do. That's easy. Let's see that. We'll start with that. So our activity start date, if we go back to our file, our activity start date is in month, day, year. This needs to be fixed anyway, but we'll do that in a moment. That is in month, day, year. Perfect. We'll hit save, make sure that's good to go. So let's also do the time. So it's still giving us a time error. So we know that that is hour, minutes, seconds. Hour, minutes, seconds. And let's save that. Okay. And then we still need a time zone. So this is where the crosstab portion goes, because we don't have time zone in our file, but we do have time, and time zone needs to supplement that category. So if we go in here and we say activity start time, just like we added to the generated values, you had multiple options to choose. It's the same way with activity start time. So I'm going to say my activity start time, time zone. So you know both are selected and both are going to be in that same column hypothetically. However, it can only check for one record in that file. So it's going to be checking for start time, and my default for start time zone, because I'm always in the same time zone, is going to be Eastern Standard Time. I'm on the East Coast right now. But it could be different depending on where you are. And so now, every time it gets a time, it's going to automatically associate it to an Eastern Time zone. We also added the media name, so let's get rid of that. And then we have project ID. That's another required file on our project ID. So let's go ahead, add that to the generated values. As you can tell, there's an easier way to add these. If you knew all the generated values you needed before, you can make sure to check all of them before we go. But for the purposes of this exercise, we're going to work through the way we have it. So let's go down and let's delete that project ID. Excuse me. Project ID should have already been imported. So if you've ever imported data, you'll realize that you've already put in project IDs. So what are those project IDs associated with your org? So let's search those. I didn't import a project ID here, but let's look for WQX test. I'm sure many people have inserted project IDs, and we can just piggyback one of those. But if you should have already organized yours, and you should be able to find it. So let's go ahead and search. There may be multiple, but we'll see. Sure. It's a variety of different types, many different. Let's use this one, just for example. All right, and let's hit save again. Always saving our work just in case something happens. And it didn't give us an error on that one. That was great. All right. Let's go to monitoring location ID. We know that is in, let's wait actually, because we're going to have to delete some. Sample collection method ID. So sample collection method ID is only required if you are submitting lab data, something that had to be analyzed. So we don't even need that in our file. So we're going to exit that out because this is all probe data. If you did know what that collection ID was, same thing. If you were importing lab data, you can do the exact same thing, just automatically generate that value. Same for your equipment. We can use that. It's not necessary, but let's. I'm not going to worry about that for now. Result detection conditions. So if you know WQX, result detection condition is when you don't have a value. But I have all values, so I'm not going to worry about that. All right, characteristic name. So we know, let's go with the first characteristic. So in column C, we have temperature, and it is measured in degrees Celsius. So let's go ahead characteristic name. We're putting all the items that we need for characteristic name. So what do we need for a characteristic name? We need the result, so the actual value that's in that, the result value, and we need the result unit. So so the name, the unit, and the result. And see, this is where the crosstab portion comes in. You're not going to see that. You're going to see how you have your characteristic name, your result unit, and it's going to be looking for the value. So the characteristic name is temperature. It's temperature water. Perfect. Great. And we'll go to result unit. And this was in degrees Celsius. Remember we saw that in the header? And there we go. And so that just mapped that one column. And we'll hit save again. Result status ID on result 1.1, characteristic name on 1.2. So let's check this out. Oh. It thinks the result status ID is on 1.2. So it thinks we're missing a result status ID. But what we're going to do is we're going to delete these other here. So because we're going to copy this one and we need them all to look like this, we're going to delete these method speciations, result sample fractions, etc. because we're not collecting anything that needs that information. Result sample fraction, we don't need that. It's thinking, the reason it's giving us the error is because it sees another result value, and so it thinks they're different there. We'll show you. So result unit, still don't need that. Once we got rid of that other result value, this is still at 1.1. Alright, so let's get rid of result status ID because we can automatically generate that. So let's go up and do that. Result status ID. Here we go. Scroll back to the top. Okay. So the result status ID is final. Alright, let's scroll down. So what else do we have? We still have analytical method ID. Well, that's not necessary. We didn't send it to a lab. Let's scroll down some more. Method, once again, no method. It was using a probe. And then our quantitation limits, it wasn't quantified at all, so it was all using the probe. Let's get rid of the limit measure. Same thing, then one more. We'll get rid of that as well. Okay, so we have status ID, project ID, activity type, activity media name, result value type. This is an actual, so it's not calculated. So that's another generated value we can create. Let's go down to result value type. As you can see, they have the elements here on the left. So if it starts with the result, you go to the result ones, and then they're in alphabetical order. Result value type. Perfect. Okay. Alrighty. And so we know that's actual. Automatically generate the value, actual. Let's save this again just to make sure we're covered. Okay. An element can be used in only one of these contexts, a generated header row, column, so it thinks there's two of them that are existing. Got to get rid of result value type because it exists in two locations. Perfect. Okay, so now we can see that this is a smaller import configuration than we had before. And this setup here, characteristic name, result unit, result value, is going to look the same as it does on every single other column. So the next is specific conductance, %DO, or dissolved oxygen, % saturation, etc. So what we're going to do is we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 more columns just like that. So we're going to go back to the import configuration, and we have 6 more, so we have a total of 7. So this is the copy button. Let's copy it. So we've copied it once. copy it twice. You can see that now we have 3. We need a total of 7. So we have 1, 2, 3. Copy it. 4. 5. This is a new feature. This is a great tool to have. And 6. Double count. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. We need one more. 7. And so now we have an import configuration that has columns A through K. So let's look at our data set. A through K, that's correct. Let's make sure our monitoring location, though, is in J, not in C. Because you can see that it's in C here. It got moved up, but it actually exists in J over here. Let's go ahead and save that real quick, because we've done a lot of work. And then you just go through and you fix them. So you know in column D, that is, let's double check that again, that is specific conductance, microsiemens. Perfect, and so now we're going to go in and we're going to see that the characteristic is that, but it's not degrees Celsius, so we need to make sure that is correct. We need to make sure to edit those. So let's go down to M. Let's save. And then you do that for the remaining characteristics. So you would go through and then you'd say in column E, it's not temperature, it's pH, and you continue to edit it. That's exactly how it works. And so once you're done, you hit save. So once all of those are fixed in, the characteristic names are corrected as well as the units, you hit save. And then you would go in, I'm going to save this, and then you would go in just like normal and you'd say import results and activities into the staging area. You choose your import configuration, and this is my crosstab example. I would select it. And so I accidentally said that this was a CS or an XOS, so we should have changed that on the import configuration. It needs to be a comma delimited because that's what this file is. See how it says .csv? So it's a comma delimited file. I'm going to exit out of that file. Alright, so now we have all the generated values, and then you would just choose file. This file exists on my desktop. You navigate to where the CSV is there. Example data. And then you'd hit continue. And that's exactly how you create and submit a crosstab import configuration. If you have any further questions, go ahead and contact the Stora Help Desk at stora@epa.gov or call us at 1-800-424-9067. Thank you.